Good afternoon and welcome to Confronting the Locust Effect, the Rule of Law in Developing Nations. I'm Josh Good, and in my role managing AES Values and Capitalism Project, I have the privilege of working closely with Christian college students and faculty. And on the 54 campuses where we work, there's perhaps no organization better known and with a stronger student following than IJM, the International Justice Mission, with its clarion call to justice for the oppressed, recognizing and rescuing captives throughout the world, and seeing clear connections between the God of the Bible and his mission of justice, legal justice, practical justice in the world. When the book of Amos beckons, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, IJM gives many evangelicals and others a clear sense of what that can look like. With IJM President Gary Haugen here to speak with us today, I know we're in for a treat. And you have Gary's bio in front of you, along with our other speakers. In Gary's case, noting his history with DOJ and working on reconciliation in South Africa, his work as a UN officer in Rwanda, working on the aftermath of the genocide, and 3 outstanding books that precede this one. The Locust Effect, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. Every year, I get to meet top law school grads who have heard Gary speak years ago at their own college or at Urbana or at other places. And if you've ever been to an annual dinner for IJM or its prayer breakfast conference, its prayer conference, you've seen firsthand how its staff of more than 600 men and women throughout the world are changing the world, quite literally. But of course, the book that we are here to discuss today is focused not so much on rescuing specific trafficked women from brothels in the Philippines, or particular children from backbreaking labor camps in India. Instead, it's focused on holistic justice systems. Gary and Victor point out from surveying many regions of the world where IJM is working that if you're not safe, nothing else matters. Moreover, it's quite typical for relief and development organizations and other anti-poverty groups to work in silos. That often happens because the justice systems where anti-poverty workers do their hardest work are so broken that it seems hopeless to think of changing them, actually reforming them. And so when public officials are on the take, if all you've known is the police, from the police's extortion, it can seem fruitless to even begin to imagine the kind of flowing justice and righteousness pictured in the Judeo-Christian vision, and to a considerable extent practiced in the developing world, where property rights are protected, where to a greater or lesser degree we experience, in fact, equal justice under law. So today we will be discussing the causes of poverty and not just its symptoms. Citing this book, our goal will be to walk with the poor into the secret terror that lies beneath the surface of their poverty. This summer, AEI's Values and Capitalism Project will publish our 14th short primer, little mini books that are aimed at college sophomores and juniors, entitled Entrepreneurship for a Flourishing World. Its authors cite Brian Fickert and Steve Corbett, who, like Gary, recently wrote a bestseller popularizing a critically important foundational building block idea, that is, that poverty is not just a material condition. Poverty, it turns out, is also a psychology, a mentality experienced by those whose daily life is marred by recurring, long-standing abuses, often by those who are in authority. Many Western poverty experts define poverty as living on less than X dollars a day, be it $1 or $2 a day. But if you ask poor people to define for themselves what it means to be poor, as the World Bank recently commissioned in a survey, a worldwide survey, it's fear, it's shame, it's a sense of helplessness and knowing there's nothing I can do when the powers that be take advantage of me. And that's quite similar to what Gary and Victor say in this book, and that is that poverty is in fact mired in violence, in insecurity, in legal uncertainty, and never knowing when that knock in the door will grab my property or lead to gross injustice of most of us in this room can scarcely imagine. So what's to be done? Well, quite a lot, actually. As described in a terrific chapter, it's been done before, that describes the legal building blocks and hard work of strengthening justice systems, as we've seen in the history of the West and other developed lands. What we need, Gary says, are long-term committed justice workers, future lawyers who protect property rights, criminal justice trainers, police officers, prison system officials, and civil servants who march to a different drumbeat and through years of hard work take into account reform lessons learned in other settings. That's why I'm so pleased that we are joined today by Tom Hart, the president of the One Campaign, who's not only a close personal friend and colleague of U2's Bono, but also someone with deep Hill experience and considerable frontline ties to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Global Fund, and the Episcopal Church USA. Tom has worked for 2 Democratic senators. He's been active in working with a number of partners in Africa and helping that continent change for well over a decade, as you see from his bio in front of you. I thought it was very fitting that this week, in connection with One's 10-year anniversary, Mike Gerson published a post on Facebook with Tom and President Bush in October 2005 in the Oval Office, hammering out some of the early implementation details of PEPFAR, just to give you a sense of his deep roots. And so following Gary's presentation, we'll hear from Tom about some of the One Campaign's work as it relates to this subject. And finally, AEI's Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy, AEI scholar, political economist, and demographer Nick Eberstadt, who has been looking at a number of these issues in a scholarly manner for decades, will offer the panel's closing remarks before we then turn to you for questions and discussion. Nick has 2 outstanding articles on the topic at hand. I think a number of you were able to pick up as you came in. One from 2006, another from 2010, looking at Haiti and also sub-Saharan Africa as test cases for the ways in which poverty is always tied to other realities, including police corruption, gang violence, and a larger culture of poverty that must be looked at unblinkingly if we are ever to help the poorest of our brothers and sisters in a sustained way. And so with that, we turn to Gary Haugen to start us off. I'm pleased to report that a number of evangelical students and professors, despite the end of the school year, are joining us today via live stream. And so if you're tweeting, please do so using hashtag Locust Effect to keep the conversation underway in the Twitterverse. Gary Haugen, welcome to AEI.
Good. Great. Well, again, thank you, Josh. And Nick, thank you for instructions on the microphone and your willingness to engage the book today. And Tom, thank you very much for being part of the discussion. Thank you, AEI, for also serving food. It's always a great comfort to me when I know that there's going to be food served at an engagement like this so that the room will be full. But it's nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us for the conversation today. We are here today to talk about global poverty. But before we do that, I would like to bring the conversation very much close at home and have you listen with me for a moment to a 911 call from the United States. It's the story of a young woman just a few months ago in Oregon who found herself at home alone on a dark weekend night in her own house in a rural part of Oregon. She's home alone, and she suddenly begins to hear a man yelling and screaming and tearing into her house. And this is the man who's starting to tear open the window to try to make his way into her house. Now, she recognizes him right away because this is the same man who had put her in the hospital through an assault just 2 weeks before. And now he is tearing his way into the home. So she does what any one of us would do. She just picks up the phone and calls 911, where she proceeds to learn that because of budget cuts in her rural area, there is no law enforcement available on the weekend. So listen to this conversation as this poor 911 operator has to try to explain the fact that there's no law enforcement coming for her.
I don't have anybody to send out there. Okay. Obviously if he comes inside the residence and assaults you, can you ask him to go away, or do you know if he's intoxicated or anything?
I've already asked him. I've already told him I was calling you. He's spoken before, busted down my door, assaulted me. So...
Is there any way you can safely leave the residence?
No, I can't. Because he's blocking pretty much my only way out.
Well, the only thing I can do is give you some advice and call the sheriff's office tomorrow. Obviously, if he comes in and unfortunately has a weapon or is trying to cause you physical harm, that's a different story. The sheriff's office doesn't work up there. I don't have anybody to send.
Yeah, regrettably, the truth is the man did tear his way into the house, horrifically assaulted her, choked her, and raped her. And the reason I play this, of course, is just simply because it brings home to us the reality of what happens when there is no law enforcement for you. When, as the 911 operator says, we have no one to send for you. And the reason we start with that is simply to bring us to the place where billions of human beings are in the world today. According to a very careful study done by the UN, about 4 billion people in our world live outside the protection of law. What would it mean to be outside the protection of the most basic law enforcement? This is certainly true for those who are poorest in our world, especially for those who live off about $2 a day. So about 2.5 billion people live not only in poverty, but they live outside the protection of law. Now, what does that look like? That's a large statistic, but what does that actually sort of feel like for people living in the developing world? Well, if you live in Bolivia, for instance, and if you were to sexually assault a child in Bolivia, you would be at greater risk of slipping in the shower and dying than you would be of ever going to jail for that crime. Or in India, if you were to enslave someone, statistics now show that you're at greater risk of being struck by lightning than you are of ever being sent to jail for committing the crime of enslaving another human being. This is the utter breakdown and collapse of functioning criminal justice systems in the developing world that are leaving billions of the poorest utterly exposed and vulnerable to violence. This collapse of criminal justice systems in the developing world has now unleashed this epidemic of violence. And what we try to do in the Locust Effect is take readers sort of into that world of violence. We are in many ways familiar with other aspects of poverty, of the hunger, the bad housing, the poor sanitation, the disease. But there is something that lies beneath the surface of the poverty that we're familiar with visually, and that is an epidemic of violence. There are 4 categories of violence that we particularly try to take readers into, because these are the 4 categories of violence that seem to most pervasively undermine the prospects of the poor to move forward. The first is the problem of gender violence, which is simply sexual violence and domestic abuse of women and girls. The book begins by telling the story of Lucilla, a typical mom in an Andean town in Peru. There's nothing about her town that you would otherwise notice, except for the fact that the time that I was visiting it, it was experiencing rates of sexual assault that were greater than those that were coming from reports of the war zones in the Congo. But you would never know, because it is a level of sexual violence that stays off the headlines, and it's not part of what grabs our attention. In fact, what the book tries to introduce us to is everyday violence, rather than the violence that tends to grab our attention in headlines, more the sort of catastrophic violence that we hear about, for instance, with genocides or conflicts or war. I'm familiar with that kind of massive violence, particularly because of my experience as the director of the genocide investigation in Rwanda in 1994, where just a few weeks after the war, I was given a list of about 100 different mass graves and massacre sites where 800,000 people had been butchered by their neighbors. And that kind of catastrophe doesn't grab our attention soon enough, but frequently, eventually it does. And so we're focused on that kind of catastrophic violence. But what we're finding is that there's something that actually will end up decimating far more of the poor than war or conflict, and that is simply everyday violence. And we have to begin with gender violence, violence against women and girls. Lucilla, as I mentioned, she herself is just living in a poor Andean town, and she herself has been run out of her home by domestic violence. Her own mother was also a victim of domestic violence. And the book just begins by going on the investigation as Lucilla tries to get justice for the rape and murder of her 8-year-old daughter, who is just dumped out on the streets. And for us to experience what is it like for a poor person to try to actually get justice when you have been the victim of such a horrific crime. Gender violence, the World Health Organization has found, actually accounts for more death and disability for girls between the age of 15 and 44 than cancer, malaria, car accidents, and war combined. So again, it's the everyday violence that is devastating the hope of the poor. The way that the airline crash will get everyone's attention, but it's actually the daily car accidents that actually imperil most people. Likewise for the poor, it is this grinding daily violence. The second category of violence afflicting the poor quite massively is straight up slavery. We now know that there are about 30 million people held in poverty by force through slavery in the world today. One of the places where the book takes us to explore this is to go to Bangalore in India, which we all recognize as the high-tech capital of India. It's the place where Thomas Friedman sort of articulates this epiphany that the world is now becoming flat because there's equal capacity in some ways to compete and to engage. But I could go to Bangalore and have a lawyer take me just a few minutes outside the beltway surrounding Bangalore and sit with this young woman, Mariama, as she and about a dozen others explained their story of having being taken into slavery in a brick factory where they work 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, just making and carrying bricks. There are in India close to 15 million people held illegally in slavery today. So this is the other sort of massive form of violence against the poor, is straight up slavery and forced labor. The third category of horrific abuse that you'll find in the slums throughout the developing world, ironically, is actually police abuse. The World Bank did another study, the largest study they had done of actually the daily experience of the poor. And what they found, and they said this was one of their most surprising findings, is that the police actually make poor people less secure, and they make police poor. They found that the justice systems actually worked against the capacity of the poor person to move forward. One of the ways that this is manifest is the 10 million people a year who are taken into pre-trial detention. And the way, especially for a poor person who can't pay a bribe, or a poor person who's thrown into prison because the police can't find the real culprit for a crime, so they'll just grab the weakest person with the most vulnerable circumstance and throw them into jail. And those 10 million people who are thrown into prison and are held there without charge or trial for extended periods of time, they aren't just the only ones who are victimized, because connected to each one of those prisoners is usually a family that is in some ways dependent upon the earning potential of the one who's thrown into prison. So the massive police abuse and then incarceration in the developing world is another sort of deadly blow to the poor trying to move out of poverty. The fourth very significant category of violence against the poor is land theft. There's at least 5 million poor people who find themselves thrown off their land each year around the world. Many times it's, of course, those who are most vulnerable, like widows, especially widows in Africa. Susan is a widow in Africa and has typically found herself thrown into destitution. Why? Because she can't raise crops, because she doesn't know how to take care of her family? No, because she's been thrown into destitution by a more powerful family in the neighborhood that just threw her off her land. Widows in the developing world, this was stunning to me, support 500 million orphans. So again, you can see what happens if the widow is thrown off her land. It's not only the destitution that she experiences, but then all those who are dependent upon her. So what the Locust effect tries to do is take us beyond what we typically think of when we think of poverty, the hunger, the disease, the lack of education, the lack of capital, and begin to look at this incredible peril of violence that faces the common poor person. Violence is sometimes harder to see because it's intentionally hidden. Unlike these other aspects of poverty, there isn't a person actually trying to hide it, but for the perpetrators of violence, they are trying to hide it. And many times the victims of abuse are likewise out of fear or shame, unlikely to tell you about it. And so there's this vast epidemic of violence taking place below the surface. What the book also tries to do is begin to see, well, what's the effect of this? of all this violence and lawlessness. And that's, of course, why we come up with the title, The Locust Effect. Because this is the way predatory violence works. It just descends upon the poor like locusts, in the way that the locust will just destroy everything in its path. It comes from this picture of these poor farmers who scrape at the earth, trying to plow and plant to try to get themselves and their families out of poverty. And then on a single day, the locust can descend and just destroy it all. And the key thing here is not only the way that predatory violence descends to destroy all of the things that a poor person was struggling to do to get out of poverty, but also the way in which those traditional things we try to do to get out of poverty or to assist the poor, those things don't stop the locusts. Those things don't stop violence, which means we need to start thinking about and talking about and responding to violence differently, or rather, responding differently to poverty than the way we have, because we've been leaving out substantially addressing the problem of violence. One of the ways that this is manifest so tragically in our era, that is the locust effect, or the ripple effect of violence, and the way it undermines other efforts to assist the poor, is the effect of education for girls. We now know that one of the most powerful things you can do is to get a young girl educated in the developing world. In fact, they call it the girl effect. But what studies are also now showing is one of the chief reasons girls are not going to school in the developing world is because of violence. Violence on the way to school, violence in school, violence in the home that keeps them from going to school. So again, it's a picture of something that is so precious, like education, that is being undermined by violence. And the story here is, of course, not that education doesn't work, or that medicine doesn't work, or that food programs don't work, or all these other efforts don't work. It's rather to say they are so powerful in their capacity to help those who are poor that we need to make sure we're protecting them from the violence that can so easily undermine the impact of those efforts to assist the poor. That would be the story here of Laura, who was a young girl that we know from Nairobi, who was sexually assaulted 3 times by the time she was 11 years of age. Assaulted in the home, assaulted on the way to school, assaulted in the neighborhood. And how is Laura going to move forward in school in that environment? She's simply not able to. And so we need to begin to not only increase our capacities to assist the poor with the traditional approaches and innovative programs that we are coming up with, but begin to look really hard at the way those efforts are also being now undermined by this violence unleashed by the brokenness of criminal justice systems. I want to return to that theme for just a moment and be very, very clear that from the perspective of our findings, the primary reason there is so much violence against the poor is really quite straightforward, and that is there is no credible criminal deterrent from those who would hurt the poor. In other words, this is all crime of opportunity. People abuse the poor because they can. And so then that turns, if you have any experience in the developing world, you probably would have had an opportunity to actually touch on the brokenness of the policing, the criminal justice system, the police, the courts, the prosecutors. Certainly the data that emerges in the book is that these systems are working backwards. It's as if you were to discover that the hospitals and clinics in the developing world make everyone sicker. Or if you were to discover that the schools in the developing world actually, they undermine illiteracy. They undermine literacy. The intended effect of criminal justice systems, of course, is to make everyone safer, provides the basic platform for everyone to move forward. But criminal justice systems in the developing world are actually making poor people less safe. So the question is, why are these systems so broken? We suggest 4 really quite surprising answers in the book. The first one is simply that these criminal justice systems, as they now operate in the developing world, were never intended to protect the common citizens from crime. Criminal justice systems in the developing world are actually set up by colonial powers and have never been re-engineered for a different purpose. They were set up for the purpose of protecting the regime from violence, not protecting the common person from violence. And so if you go into the developing world, you will find that the training, the organizing, administration, is not aimed for equipping a force that will protect the common person from violence, and that's precisely why it does not do so. So while the poor have laws in the developing world, and those have changed tremendously over the last 50 years, we've changed the laws. What we have not done is change the law enforcement system, and it simply doesn't work. The second very critical reason for the utter collapse of criminal justice systems in the developing world is that those with wealth and money and commercial interests have abandoned the public criminal justice systems and have set up private systems of security and of justice. This means that probably if you've been to the developing world and if you were going about it safely, you were under probably the protection of some private security. This is why now in the developing world it's a two-tier system. Those who can afford to pay for their own security and are safe, and those who cannot afford to pay for private security and therefore are not. This has been a phenomenal transformation in the developing world of the withdrawal and abandonment of public systems of justice and the great growth of private systems of justice, which only allow the wealthiest the security to move forward. So in a place like India, which now has the largest civilian police force, but it's only a quarter of the size of the private security forces in India. Or in Guatemala, where the private security forces are 7 times larger than the public police force. In Africa now, the largest employer on the continent is private security. So this is the second reason for the collapse of criminal justice systems, is that they've been abandoned by people of affluence and influence, and those systems just get worse and worse. The third reason for the utter just dysfunction of criminal justice systems is that they've been neglected by our traditional aid and development efforts. We've focused on the traditional problems of hunger and public health and education, which are all vital and critically important. But we've done the numbers, and you can't find 1% of foreign assistance going effectively to be able to actually strengthen law enforcement so it protects the poor from violence. And finally, the last reason, which is probably not so surprising, is that it turns out that there are political and economic elites in the developing world who actually benefit from broken criminal justice systems. And if there were functioning criminal justice systems that actually protected the common poor person from crime and from exploitation, there would be people who would feel threatened by enforcement of the law. And so there are the political economy of the developing world is also working against building and strengthening law enforcement. So after sort of depressing everyone with all of that, the question is there any hope? The book attempts to be very clear that, number one, yes, we have to actually understand the depth of the problem, and we can't sugarcoat this. But secondly, there is hope, and the first place of hope for sure is to be found in history. This, for me, has been the most encouraging thing, perhaps, is to go back and to recover the history of how did we get functioning criminal justice systems? How did other countries and other cities around the world that now benefit from reasonably functioning law enforcement, did those systems simply fall from heaven? Have they always been ones that worked well and have not been corrupt or haven't been brutal? Well, the actual lesson from history is that there is no criminal justice system on the planet that at one point was not brutal and was not corrupt. And so what the book does is it takes us through the lost story of how it is that we, even here in the United States, were able to fashion together reasonably functioning criminal justice systems that surely don't work perfect. And I spent most of my career at the Department of Justice dealing with police misconduct and abuses here in the United States. Of course, there's nothing perfect about it. But we have the opportunity to live in communities that are reasonably safe, even for those who are economically disadvantaged and are poor, because we have functioning criminal justice systems. But those justice systems would be unrecognizable if you went back 100 years ago, 130 years ago. In fact, there is no city that we currently work in the developing world that's any worse than what New York would have been, or Chicago, or LA, or places in Texas, or other parts of the United States 150 years ago. So it's a matter of sort of recovering the story of how law enforcement is secured for the common citizenry. And we also then point to projects going on around the world that are actually also bringing hope. In other words, they're demonstrating what's possible today. One of those is a project that we did with the Gates Foundation in the Philippines, where we focused on the second largest city of the Philippines called Cebu, which had a problem of child sex trafficking, which again is just a problem that preys specifically upon the poor. And it's illegal. So the problem is not usually the existence of laws, the problem is a lack of law enforcement. So we asked the question, what if you could stand up law enforcement so that they actually began to prosecute effectively those who are sex trafficking with children? And over a 4-year period of time, we were able to demonstrate a 79% reduction in the victimization of children in the commercial sex trade over a 4-year period of time as a result of standing up law enforcement and actually proving that two things are possible. Number one, you can change law enforcement in the developing world so it actually does what it's supposed to, because a huge hindrance right now is a total loss of hope that you could ever get broken law enforcement to work in the developing world. And we wanted to focus on one place to just show, no, it's possible. And not only can law enforcement change, but secondly, when it does, it has a dramatic impact on categories of violence against the poor. Poverty was not reduced in Cebu during that 4-year period of time in any way that we could measure, but we were able to reduce violence substantially because it was just violence against the poor that was committed because people could. And when people start to pay a price for committing these abuses, the abuses stop. Again, this is not a reason not to fight poverty in Cebu. We still have all good reasons to do that. But we don't have to wait for that to be completed in order for us also, in a parallel way, to make very important progress in reducing crime and violence against the poor, which will actually support and assist the poor in being able to move forward. So our fundamental desire is that we would just begin to change the conversation about poverty. The Locust effect doesn't present all the answers by any means. In fact, it's not supposed to be the conversation stopper. It's supposed to be this conversation starter. And I'm so grateful that we can continue that conversation here today to begin to say, we need to take seriously the problem of violence against the poor and its underlying cause in the developing world, which is the utter dysfunction of public criminal justice systems, and to begin to work together to see that reversed so that the other things that we do to assist the poor can be secured in their benefit to those who deserve our very best efforts. Thank you very much.
Great. I think my microphone's on. Thanks, Gary. That was terrific to hear you speak of it. It was terrific to read the words. I have to admit, I started with a lot of questions, and my own sort of transformation as I read and heard you is complete, and I think you've done something very powerful and very important here. So let me first just thank you for doing the book, and thank you for presenting. Let me thank AEI for hosting this session, and for Josh. It's a terrific topic. I guess I'm the guy representing the community that's ignored this issue, so bring it on. Lots of harsh criticisms and questions I welcome. So I've worked on global poverty reduction and disease reduction for my whole career. I admit this is not an issue I was familiar with, and so this has been terrific for me. Classic case of judging a book by its cover. It was the subtitle that sort of threw me right off, which was, why the end of poverty requires the end of violence. I'm like, well, hold on a minute. I've been doing all sorts of great stuff for 15 years and ended a lot, help tackle poverty, and yet, we haven't worked on violence and all the rest. But I do think, and I think there's some subtle points that I want to talk about and probe a little bit, but end up going from skeptic to supporter here. So the One Campaign is a nonprofit advocacy and campaigning organization, as Josh said, probably best known by our co-founder, Bono. We're not active on the ground in poor countries. We're not like CARE or Oxfam or USAID. We focus on public policy here in the United States and other wealthy countries. We were, part of the conversations that helped create President Bush's PEPFAR HIV/AIDS program and Millennium Challenge Corporation. We're very active now, focusing on electricity and agriculture initiatives. We do both sort of classic inside Washington lobbying and policy work, and outside the Beltway campaigning, advocacy. Since you have so many students and campus folks engaged in this session, I wanted to mention one campaign has a very active student engagement called the One Campus Challenge. We have 140 chapters around the country where we engage students in these challenges and competitions with one another for advocacy around our various campaigns, whether it's health or agriculture or transparency, or more recently, energy. And let me just say, my initial reaction to Gary's hypothesis was, well, we've done an awful lot on fighting poverty. In the last 20 years, extreme poverty, those living on less than $1.25 a day, has been cut in half. It was around 40% of the world's population, now around 20%. That's fairly astonishing figure, and one that we ought to be very proud of. Even if the community has forgotten or ignored an important issue and probably a dozen others, that's a real achievement, and one that we as a community and frankly as a nation ought to be very proud of. A lot of that reduction in poverty has happened in China and India. Let's be frank, there are a lot of people there, and it's been quite an incredible growth in those two countries. But that is too simple an explanation. There are 16 African countries that have also cut extreme poverty in half over that same time period. And if you want to know where the growth and where the action is, just ask the Chinese and the Indians. They are all over Africa. So there's quite a lot of very exciting things happening in the poorest parts of the world, especially Africa, where one's advocacy is focused. And then not only has extreme poverty been cut in half, there are models showing us that it's possible to virtually eliminate it in the next 15 years. The World Bank is showing us that if we continue and indeed have to accelerate a bit of the progress that we have made in terms of growth in the poorest countries, extreme poverty could be eliminated. So those of you who are in school right now could raise your children in a world where there isn't extreme poverty. That doesn't mean all the problems have been solved. There'll be 15 other problems to deal with. But again, that is quite an exciting place to be. So if your goal is to eliminate extreme poverty, what should you focus on? Well, let me talk about some of the things we have focused on and why I think they remain important, although Gary is pointing out an area that has been neglected. So global health. If you just look at the health impacts on economic growth, if people who are moderately well off, a quarter to a third of them who slip into poverty are as a result of ill health. Or the reverse, those who are poor, good health improvements have accounted for about 25% of improvements in economic growth. So health clearly has an impact. Agriculture, World Development Report has shown that investments in agriculture are 2 to 4 times have more impact than any other investment in terms of economic growth. There's almost no modern economy that has gotten there without getting it right in the agriculture sector. Education, Gary mentioned. No question that education, direct correlation with GDP and economic growth. Quite a stunning stat pulled up that if all students in low-income countries completed school with basic reading skills, 171 million people would be lifted out of poverty. This would be a 12% cut as a direct result of all kids being able to complete a basic education with reading skills. Investments in infrastructure, a little more elusive to figure out why building ports and roads and others, the exact direct correlation with extreme poverty, but let me quote Bill Gates, who was actually at a session here at AEI where he said, well, look, if you're trying to get your crop from a rural farm to a market, or you're trying to get medicine from the port to a village, a road is a fairly clever invention. So clearly, infrastructure has an impact on all of these health and economic outcomes. So does the end of poverty require the end of violence? And again, just to admit up front, I sort of started out thinking, well, not really. It clearly is important. Let me state, I should have stated right up front. There's no doubt that the end of violence is an important end in itself. Whether or not there's any link to poverty, people should not suffer indignity and suffering of violence. And so I think there's an argument here to tackle this neglected issue, regardless of its impact on poverty. But, and you know, so is it, and does it disproportionately impact the poor? Yes. Is it ignored and under-resourced? Yes. Does it make me want to jump out of my chair and work on it? Yes. I get it. Gary's convinced me. I do think that, you know, the link between violence and poverty, though, is an interesting one. And I began to think about, you know, the fact that Gary cites in the book several times how sexual violence and forced labor are often are perpetrated on the poor. And I thought, well, right, because people are so desperate, they're lured into these situations because there's a chance to make money. One of the tragedies are sometimes that's the only option, and you're so desperate to feed your family or care for your kids. So again, is the violence wrought upon mostly girls and women in this case, you know, contributing to the poverty, or is the poverty leading to a situation where people can be exploited? Violence as a deterrent to schooling. Absolutely, it is, but I was thinking of questions like, well, of course, so are school fees a deterrent to schooling. So are the fact that girls often have to spend 6 or 8 hours collecting wood and water at home, and so they don't get to go to school. So is violence the main reason kids don't go to school? The fact that teachers don't show up and bother to teach? Again, lots and lots of different factors. Clearly, protection from violence is something the poor need, but does it make them less poor? And I think I finally concluded the answer is yes. It's a complicated one, but I do think that it is a neglected piece of the puzzle that we need more investment. I look a little bit about like HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS is both mostly a symptom of poverty. It is most people who have HIV are poor. It is also a contributor to poverty. It takes people out of the workforce. It's obviously wreaks havoc on the most productive members of society. Malaria, the same way. Most people who have malaria are poor, and people who are poor get malaria and then spend weeks and weeks out of work. So I do think violence is both a symptom and a cause. You don't go to school, you don't get educated, you don't have the knock-on economic benefits. You're thrown off your land because of a violent altercation. You obviously can't grow crops or use your land for any kind of collateral. So how do you tackle it? Look, I'm to my left is the foremost expert on this. I'm not going to try to answer that question. It's obviously extremely hard to do. It's really complicated. You're dealing with cultural barriers, financial barriers, governments who have an interest in this, and you know, unlike HIV or hunger, you know, the West can swoop in. I'm oversimplifying. Swoop in with our medicine and our food and solve some problems. You can't do that with law enforcement. We can't, you know, ship enough handcuffs over and expect the problem to get taken care of. And we obviously don't do it very well. I mean, I look at our aid structures and the World Bank. We clearly don't do it very well. Here's a glimmer of hope, though, even though we don't do it very well. If I were sitting in front of you 10 years ago, we didn't do HIV/AIDS treatment very well either. People said, you can't possibly treat Africans because they don't have wristwatches to tell what time to take these drugs. And it was true. These were high-tech drugs taken multiple times a day, some with food, some without, in the poorest parts of rural Africa. Are you kidding me? And then change happened. And today, the United States is responsible for nearly 8 million lives on these antiretroviral drugs. I use the word astonishing. That's the reason I keep coming to work every day, because I've seen the kind of challenges that confront the poorest around the world, particularly in Africa. I've seen when political will and science and leadership from politicians, let's give credit where credit's due, gather together around problems and they really can't solve them. So I'm not at all hopeless by the challenge that Gary puts forward to us. I do think it is a neglected, underappreciated symptom with some very, very complicated solutions. But I'm so excited that you raised it. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's right, the button cup. Thank you all for coming today. Gary, thank you for your address. And most importantly, Gary, thank you for your work and for this book. This is a tremendously important book This is, if you follow my drift, an aha moment book. You know, when you read it, it's all so obvious, except that nobody's said it before. It clarifies so much about what we should be doing in engaging with the low-income world. At one and the same time, it strikes at the heart of the existing materialist fallacy in modern development economics thinking. And it also shows us how far those of us in the rich world who want to help, how far we're actually removed from the poor people that we want to help. We talk a lot about poverty, and well, we should. But there are gradations of the human condition that have to be appreciated. There is poverty, there is also such a thing as misery. There is also such a thing as degradation. They are not necessarily the same thing, but they are embodied in human beings. And if you have an approach that sees development as the extension of human choice and the reaffirmation of human dignity, like Nobel laureate in economics A.K. Sen has suggested, there's really no problem there. These really aren't divisible portions. It's a seamless web, and I think Gary reminds us of this. Development economics theory, I think, has a lot to answer for over the last 60 years. There is the scientistic phase of theory, which saw people more or less as kind of arithmetic building blocks, kind of falsely applied premises from the natural sciences that really aren't suitable to real live human souls. There is the phase with known as the basic human needs phase, which was supposed to redistribute us out of poverty and misery. Fascinating as it may be, the people who talked about basic human needs never talked about human security or the protection of individuals, as if this wasn't a basic human need. And today we have the Millennium Development Goals, which also have no space, no place for the protection of individuals from violence. People commit a lot of social science in the world, and they're usually not held accountable for committing social science. But there is one sentence from all of the social science that has been committed in this millennium that should never, ever be forgotten. And it is, in fact, from the Millennium Development Goals report. And it is this sentence, and I'll repeat it for you twice. Many well-governed countries are too poor to help themselves. Just let that sink in for a second. I'll say it again. Many well-governed countries are too poor to help themselves. Well, it's not possible to get everything about the way the world works wrong in a single sentence. But if you wanted to have a kind of a starter version, this kind of gets at it. And you can see how remarkably tone-deaf the Solons of the MDGs are if this is the way that they look at the world in considering what real human needs are. Anyway, this is a remarkable, important book. I have two questions I'd like to pose to Gary, and he may choose to respond to them or not. That's your prerogative as a guest at AEI. But these are two things that just occurred to me from reading your book, and very interested in what you think. Different legal traditions around the world and their opportunities or possibilities for protecting the poor in different parts of the world. I think of three big distinctions, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm completely out of my depth in this area. But I think of the difference between the common law tradition, where you might say, at least in some parts of the world, there was this organic development of law, kind of over time, Oakshottian, Burkean, whatever. and the civil law tradition where a state or a Napoleon or whomever comes in and declares law and promulgates it. And then we also, of course, now have countries that are ruled by Sharia law. So what are the prospects for the poor and vulnerable under these systems? Is it too simplistic to divide them in this tripartite way? Does it have to do with something else? How does one get at this? And the second question is about the notion of charter cities. Up a little bit north of here at NYU in New York, the economist Paul Romer, who's been associated with what's called the New Growth Theory, has come up with, it's more than a conjecture, less than a project. He's come up with this idea that maybe in third world countries, we can have charter cities which are protected, which have laws of their own, where people vote with their feet to come to these areas. He has described this mainly as a concept for entrepreneurship and growth. But of course, the only way that a charter city could possibly work was if it had a legal system that protected individuals' rights of all different sorts. So, I mean, at the moment, this is maybe a kind of a fanciful idea, but what do you think about this charter cities thing? You know, thank you all very much.
Well, two questions have been posed to Gary, so maybe we can start with that, and then we'll turn to you for questions. Remember, the AEI House rules are to state your protest statement in the form of a question, so we'll try to keep you honest about that, given the terrific room that's here. But first questions to Gary.
Well, first of all, I'd like to express kindness for the remarks, and maybe, Tom, just starting with some of the things that you shared, I do find that one of the most hopeful analogies of this is the AIDS epidemic. That is to say, if you solve the AIDS epidemic, have you taken care of poverty? No, you haven't. But if you don't address the AIDS epidemic, which is what we sort of began to discover in the 90s, the AIDS epidemic is going to roll over just about everything else that you're trying to do. So that just creates some urgency. This is a really bad problem, and we don't know how to stop this or fix this. Should we therefore not try? The AIDS epidemic is a painful story of showing up too late, for sure, but it's also a wonderful story of the way, as you said, human endeavor really engaged a problem, and the world is different as a result, and millions are alive as a result, and millions will never die as a result. And that's the way we look at violence, is that, well, if you establish basic criminal justice systems that protect the common person from violence, will you then have opened up the road for them to prosper in every way? Well, that's just about all you have done, is just open the road. They will still have every one of those challenges, but it will at least make it plausible for folks to be able to engage that effort and the assistance that others are offering. And you're also correct to say there is not a great cookie-cutter solution to how to get after this. The same way there wasn't actually some great vaccine that could just be mass produced and distributed to address the AIDS epidemic. But one of the arguments of the book is that the problem is so bad and functioning criminal justice systems is so indispensable that we do need to get after it. And I believe through experimentation, some projects where at least we apply ourselves to the problem, eventually we will start to come up with some things that work well. Maybe just in response to Nick's two questions, charter cities, as you said, I think has been promoted in many respects as a way to attract business engagement. We have been trying to promote the idea in a parallel way that hopefully functioning criminal justice systems will work as a competitive advantage for a jurisdiction. That is to say, and that's the way at least most of criminal justice system is established, is jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And so that you could take cities, states, even a small country, and say we're going to have a competitive advantage because we are incentivized by that to actually invest in a functioning public justice system. Because the great problem right now, as I mentioned before, is the flight from the public justice system and the way that people with wealth and money can secure themselves privately. So that has disincentivized everyone from investing in that. So until we do discover some competitive advantage to investing in a public system, I'm not sure what's going to have enough force to reverse this. As to the three legal traditions that were mentioned, all of them actually are rooted in bygone eras, in a sense, that weren't really intended to serve the purposes of empowering the common person. And they have, at least the common law tradition and the civil law tradition, had developed over time to enfranchise and empower the common voting citizen. The civil system has tended to fall away, and I would say in most places where they're starting from scratch, and it's some combination of common law and civil law. Sharia law obviously was inaugurated in an era which is not connected historically to the democratic needs of the common person. I would say that is the key, is asking the question, what legal system will at the end of the day end up serving the weakest and the most marginalized person in the community? Because a criminal justice system that works for the poorest, for the minority, for the disenfranchised, works great for everybody. And we actually have learned a lot about this over the last 100 years or so, and to bring that knowledge to bear with resources would be transformative when combined with political will.
Terrific. Well, there are two mics roaming, so with that, over to you. The first question right here, this gentleman.
Hi, my name is Jose Lobo. I'm a Georgetown University student. I'm from Mexico and my wife is from Colombia, so we know what you're talking about, violence impeding development. And my question would be, according to the latest United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Latin America is the region with the highest homicide rate in the world. And a lot of these homicides are linked to drug trafficking by organized crime organizations. What are your thoughts on drug prohibition? Would you agree that a lot of the costs are being assumed by producer countries, transferred from the consumer countries that are enforcing drug prohibition? I would like to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it would be sort of hard to argue that that was not the case in many respects. One of the things that's manifest by the sort of narco-terror that is decimating much of Central America and Latin America is it's a symptom also, or a outcome, a byproduct of neglecting law enforcement for decades. That is to say, in many respects, law enforcement, corruption, and dysfunction in Latin America was sort of a joke, right? Oh, the police are corrupt, and haha, we pay a bribe anyways, it's all fine. And then serious narco criminals take over your country, and you reach for law enforcement, and there's nothing there. And then you have to militarize that conflict, and now you're in a big problem. And it is that kind of incremental, little by little neglect of the basics, which is public justice systems that work for everybody and not a privatized system, that eventually there'll be a organized form of coercion that will come after you and challenge your private system as well.
Yes, sir. Right beside Mike.
Hello, hi. Pierce Martian with the State Department. I had the opportunity to work in Afghanistan some years back when we were writing the integrated campaign plan with Stanley McChrystal, and we were going deep into the sort of coin theory and human security concepts. And just recently, in fact, a week ago, I read this article from the 70s by James Q. Wilson on broken windows. and I forget who he wrote it with, but it's. I wish that I had known about that article at the time. It's sort of remarkable, this whole notion of how there's this distinction between actual crime rates and the sense of living in an awful place. And I just wonder if that article was on your mind at all, or if any of that sort of broken windows theory, I understand there is a whole theory around it, goes into your book at all.
Yeah, very familiar with that from a long time back. It is this idea that law enforcement in many respects works in a miraculous kind of way. That is to say, you don't actually need to physically restrain everybody who's tempted to commit a crime. You just need to create a sense of social certainty that it's likely that if you commit this abuse, you'll pay a price for it. Currently in the developing world, violent people feel that they can do anything to a poor person with very little or no risk of getting in trouble for it. I mean, think about that statistic. If you sexually assault a child in Bolivia, you're at greater risk of dying in the shower or the bath. That's another way of saying you are in no risk at all. That means there's a law on the books that says it's illegal to sexually assault a child, but that it's not illegal in any way that's useful for a child or is any way meaningful for a perpetrator. And we breathe the invisible oxygen of law enforcement every day so regularly that we manage to somehow think, well, maybe everyone in Washington is just a little nicer than people in other parts of the world. Truth is, if you took off these, at least everywhere that you can find in the world, if you take off those restraints on human beings, what the stronger do to the weak is not pretty. And yet what everyone kind of straightens up and does in a very quite civil and behaved way when certain rules are just regularly enforced. It's powerful. And these things that we've learned, one of the tragedies is that the places we have in recent years tried to hurry up and build public criminal justice systems in Iraq and Afghanistan have been two places in which, if you were going to try to do that, number one, in a hurry up, and number two, in two countries you would want to pick in the world, you wouldn't probably pick those two countries for that experiment. Whereas we could give you scores of countries which right now, if they had excellent programs of assistance of their criminal justice systems, you could have a tremendous impact.
Tom or Nick on our late James Wilson on terrific Council of Treasurer Advisors. Let's go to this young lady here.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon from the New York Times. I'd like to ask, are you recommending that U.S. and in the international community to increase aid on improving criminal justice system in many countries? And what particular programs should non-government organizations should do to improve criminal justice system, and what countries should greatly benefit?
Yeah, so there's a good portion of the book that sort of tries to give a more fulsome answer to that, but the first answer is yes, it should be mainstream to our aid efforts in countries. Also, I think we should consider in our partnership with countries whether or not that country demonstrates any commitment at all to the political will and resources for a functioning criminal justice system for common poor people, because the argument can be that if you're not serious about that, you may not be a very good partner for some of the other things that we're seeking to do to assist the poor, because there needs to be some incentivizing and strengthening of those forces within the country. And almost every developing country has local champions for this struggle. So it's not so much about the U.S. and other countries swooping in and bringing the magic of Western law enforcement as much as coming alongside champions of rule of law and basic criminal law enforcement on behalf of the poor in developing world countries and seeing how they can be supported in that struggle. And yes, it should, I think, be prioritized, it should be funded, and it should be a center of learning in our development assistance, because at the moment, expertise in this area is not in the room for the most part. And that's part of why we haven't given ourselves very robustly to the effort, because we don't work hard at or take on challenges that are foreign to us. Likewise, when the AIDS epidemic started to roll through, fortunately, there already was a well-established public health community that had a lot of expertise on confronting these problems. Sadly, there isn't such a great community of expertise pre-existing, but there is knowledge and expertise that needs to be brought into these agencies. DFID has already started to do that in some areas. Even USAID and State Department, there are experts burrowed in there, but it was illegal and has been illegal to assist law enforcement in the developing world because of good reasons of the way abuses were committed during other eras. And right now, the World Bank is prohibited by policy from doing anything to strengthen policing in the developing world. And one thing to be observed is the policing is the front of the funnel for the justice system. So you can repair the courts or any other part of the justice system, but if the front end, the policing, is not addressed, you're not going to see very much success from those other efforts. So yeah, this needs to be a fundamental change in the way that we think about addressing development.
One of the not terribly expensive ways that the NGO or non-government development community could contribute to this effort, I think, would be to come up with an index. So we've got a couple of indexes of economic freedom, and these have helped change the conversation about what governments should or should not be doing in fiscal, monetary policy, protection of private property, and so forth. We've got the Transparency International Index of the Perceptions of Government Corruption, and that has been a wonderful tool for shaming governments that should be shamed. We now have the Global Slavery Index, and you refer to some of that work. Of course, it's initial. We'll have better data on that, but it should be there. I mean, it's shocking in our time that there should be 30 million people who are held in slavery. And I don't know what we want to call it, but the Haugen Index, I mean, something that's the security of the poor, and come up with something every year to show how countries are getting better or worse in this. And if we have something like that, that's going to help change the conversation.
Please, Tom.
I just wanted to bemoan the fact that at the time we began to really take seriously HIV/AIDS, we were able to expand the aid budget. This is not a moment where that's a possibility for fighting violence, unfortunately. Aid budgets are contracting globally, not just in the United States. So I'm depressed by the fact that this has been a long neglected and underinvested component of the fight against poverty at a time when those budgets are getting smaller and smaller.
It's interesting, too, to think about the Millennium Challenge Corporation and Millennium Challenge accounts that I know you worked with, Tom, in this same space. So perhaps that's another avenue. Next question. Yes, sir. Nat Nasworth, Christian Post.
Nat Nasworth of the Christian Post. So one of the things I hear a lot here at AEI is that free enterprise has made a major contribution to reducing global poverty in the last 10 to 20 years. And of course, free enterprise needs a good justice system as well, a good system of rules, laws, and so forth. And I'm looking at the four major problems. The one most connected to that is land theft. But I wonder if there's any connections that you can draw there, or if those are on two different tracks. Is there a relationship between where free enterprise has made a major contribution, and also you have an improvement of the justice system, which is also making improvements in the way that you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't find anybody who argues about, who is able to, who argues for the way in which market economies produce prosperity, who does not assume a functioning criminal justice system to secure people in their rights in person and their rights in property. It's just in many respects, we have been breathing, as I said, the invisible oxygen of that for so long. And in the developing world, it's confusing too, because there's things called police and there's things called courts, but we just don't realize they aren't doing anything like what you imagine those institutions doing in other societies, and they're working backwards. So again, yeah, I think those are they are fundamental for whatever benefits free market economies are able to achieve. And certainly those who argue all the sort of gaps of things that are not achieved by that, but you can't achieve any benefits for the common person, especially for social mobility. Because what we really want, too, is for the poor to be able to move out of poverty. And for someone to be thrown back to the ground again by violence, that's the great tragedy here.
Just a quick comment and something, Gary, I think you pointed out in the book, which really struck me. I think there's often a confusion about rule of law. I mean, that's a complicated, big chapeau of a label. What you're talking about is, I think you say, sort of garden variety domestic, violence every day, is quite different than being able to keep a contract. And that's what folks working on economic development and business and foreign direct investment who are trying to grow and help lift prosperity are focused on keeping contracts so business people can go in and actually have the contract honored, not have their property seized and this and that. That's typically justice for people who already have assets, right? Not the garden variety exploitation of the poorest. So I do think that's a helpful distinction that you make, and I wanted to raise.
Hello, Craig Welkener, Georgetown Law. Thank you so much for today. As you're talking about developing public justice systems that help everyone in developing countries, I'm sure you would acknowledge that we need to be humble and think about local values and local culture and local ways that justice would be seen and expressed. Can you talk a little bit more about how that would work out? Because in some ways, justice seems so universal, but I'm sure it needs to be adapted to local conditions. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure, because that's what you find from the history of this, is that criminal justice systems where they responded to the community and to democratic impulses, they were shaped by the values of the community. The problem is that criminal justice systems in the developing world right now are overwhelmingly just colonial systems, period. They were installed by the colonial powers and never re-engineered for the purposes or aspirations of the national people. And so one of the great sadness is the way in which political elites have been perfectly comfortable to use the colonial engineering for purposes that just did not serve the common people very well. India is the most spectacular example. They have a full-on British imperial policing system that was set up in 1860, and those documents have never been touched to redesign the system. So 85% of the largest civilian police force in the world has never been trained to investigate a crime. They've been trained to control crowds and to protect VIPs, because that's what the colonists did with their police force. Now, it is true that it will take different forms to accommodate sort of cultural differences in the community of the way the law is to be articulated and then also to be enforced. But one of the also tragic problems is that the rejection of sort of formal law enforcement systems in the developing world, which sometimes has come from the poor, because those systems are so oppressive. And then there's been the reaching for traditional or communal forms of justice. Well, a lot of those, you actually don't want to live under those rules either necessarily, because a lot of the traditional and communal systems of justice or power disenfranchised women or particular minorities. So it's an opportunity for a fresh look at, well, how do we today, that is, citizen of an emerging country, how do we want to build a criminal justice system, taking the best from what's been learned and best what's from our own community and fashion something that actually serves a poor person, the most vulnerable. That system will work well.
I was just wondering if you could, I'm Rachel Wagley with U.S. Campaign for Burma. We're a Burma policy advocacy group here in D.C. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about Burma, Myanmar, and the case, making the case in an advocacy sense for justice and accountability, because now we're seeing so many international actors going into Burma, and imposing their aid structures that they've also imposed in Afghanistan and other places in the world, and not looking at the problems with justice and accountability in Burma. And as you know, the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya going on, and then other wars with ethnic groups around the country are being overlooked by these actors, and actors are starting to see Burma as through a transitional lens in giving aid rather than a conflict lens. So I don't know, how would you approach the problem of aid in Burma through this justice lens?
I do think that one can observe that in post-conflict situations or in situations of tremendous power transition, there tends to be compromise made or shortcuts made to move past what have been, or at least try to move past injustices and abuses that have been taking place. But if that is done in a way that does not set up, it does not set up a criminal justice system that will allow there to actually be enforcement of the laws, then it's going to repeat and embed broadly in the society tremendous imbalances of power and lack of accountability, and so that large numbers of people are, even after a political transition, are not going to be safe. And this we've seen over and over again, where there's a political transition at the top, but the actual plumbing by which law is actually enforced, which is tedious and boring and no one wants to pay much attention to, if that is not attended to, it produces an outcome that just replicates and continues abuses of those who are traditionally poor in the society.
One student question that we saw asked about the role of social media in places that are particularly egregious, like Guatemala, where 7 times more is spent on private law than public law. Any thoughts about particularly roles for social media to play in shining the spotlight on injustice?
I think the traditional observation that people are finding now is that social media is tremendous for awareness, for raising people's sense of concern about issues, and actually empowering people to bring reality to the surface, because it has in many ways democratized access to knowledge and information. And so especially in the developing world, as it relates to corruption, as it relates to abuses that used to be something you could hide, it now is brought to the surface by social media. On the other hand, social media seems quite weak at actually carrying out the actual fixing of broken plumbing. That is, the fixing of the hardware that is allowing the abuses to take place. But again, raising awareness is indispensable, but it's to be seen whether or not it can raise awareness and concern and resources over the long haul to attend to the actual work-a-day work of transformation.
If you look at Nigeria, it can be a very powerful tool for advocacy to a government that is otherwise ignoring an injustice. So perhaps in that way, it can be a helpful, instigator of change.
Truly.
Yeah.
We've got lots of student questions. I'm happy to read one more, but is there one more question in the room to bring us home? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Kaylee Shanaberg, and I have a question for Gary. How often do you find when you're helping a developing justice system that the current laws that are in place are the item that's broken rather than the law enforcement or the enforcing the laws? And how does an organization like IJM help fix that and address that without seeming like the Western culture coming in and trying to change their system?
Yeah, great question. First of all, 95%, 96% of IJM staff in the developing world are local nationals serving inside their community. So we're trying to help local Cambodians or Kenyans or Indians get enforcement of their own laws in their own community to protect their own neighbors. So in that sense, that's generally not a problem. And to my colleagues will probably have a different precise answer to this, but I would say that 90% of the time the obstacle to protecting the poor from violence as we experience is not in the law, it's in the law enforcement. It's very useful as you're actually trying to then enforce the law. You do discover, oh, here's the part of the law that doesn't work. A lot of times it's pieces of procedural matter that are just insanely dysfunctional that make it impossible for law enforcement to do its job. So that's why being in the trenches, actually trying to enforce the law, is what many times manifests what is it that's inadequate about the law. And that gives you a very sound basis for changing it, not because you have some outside theoretical, abstract idea of what needs to change, but the very hands-on practical change that needs to take place because you're in the trenches actually trying to make the law work for a poor person.
Terrific. Well, I have two brief announcements, and then I look forward to thanking our panel. Briefly, we have Locust Effect books available for sale right outside. So if you'd like to purchase one of those, that's just as you walk out this door to your left. Secondly, there is a new series of TED Talks, or TED-like talks, that AEI is going to be hosting beginning June 23rd, the first of those, with 3 back-to-back successive talks on social justice and a new social justice agenda. What might that look like from 5:30 to 7 p.m. on June the 23rd in the building just across the street, National Geographic building. We would invite you to come join us for that upcoming event. And with that, thanks so very much to Gary, Nick, and Tom. Good afternoon.
That's wonderful. I hope we'll be able to